Good afternoon, everyone. The Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at Arizona State University welcomes you to a new event for the center featuring Michael Munger talking about good fences make bad COVID policy. This lecture is connected to the center's other activities. The purpose of the center is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. And we hope to increase public and academic awareness of economic liberty, the history and philosophy of economic liberty, and some of the current public policy issues, as well as the history of thinking about economic liberty. The center, this specific talk emerges out of a new role that the center has taken, providing support in programming and events for a philosophy, politics, and economics certificate program, which is now available to students across the university through the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. The certificate program includes an introductory course challenging students to think about the ways in which philosophy, politics, and economics both support and challenge each other. They take at least one course from each of the three participating programs, and then they complete the certificate with a capstone seminar that provides students with the opportunity to consider ways in which they can integrate the three disciplines together in some extended project. Today's guest blends both the mission of the center and the purpose of this new certificate well. Michael Munger is professor of political science, economics, and public policy at Duke University and the director of Duke's PPE program. He received his doctorate from Washington University, St. Louis, where he worked with Nobel laureate Doug North. He's one of the authors of the textbook that we actually are using in the first course in the philosophy, politics, and economics certificate. And he's authored a number of other books, most recently Choosing in Groups, Analytical Politics Revisiting, which will connect to his talk today. Many of you will also know that Mike is the most frequent guest on the well-known podcast Econ Talk, hosted by his friend and mine, Russ Roberts. His talk today in many ways mirrors the goal of a PPE approach. The title is Good Fences Make Bad COVID Policy, What Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Can Teach Us. There'll be time for questions at the end of Mike's talk. You can submit questions by entering them into the Q&A function, which is monitored. Don't enter them into the chat. Leave the chat for Mason to communicate with you about things connected to the chat, the discussion, and I will pose the questions that are posted in the Q&A to Mike. So Mike, it's all yours. Take it over.
Well, thanks very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I wish I could actually be there. I'm a big fan of the PPE program and of Arizona State University. I have helped in starting at least 40 different PPE programs. And I have noticed that some of the people who are most in favor of PPE are philosophy faculty who feel like they can learn more by looking outside of some of the boundaries of philosophy, and economics students who think surely there must be more to policy analysis than concerns of efficiency. So I'm going to talk today about good fences and bad policy. And there is an echo between PPE, which is about bringing down academic fences, and I think good COVID policy, which is about bringing down fences between different considerations. Now, you may recognize here on my first slide, on the left, that used to be a skateboard park, but it was filled in by the state of California to make sure that no one could use it. Because they had restrictions on people being outside. But then once it was filled in with sand, motorbike users started to use it. And so it was actually pretty difficult to keep that fence up. And then on the right, you see a guy surfing, who's actually on a stand-up surfboard outside by himself without a mask. And he was arrested for having broken the lockdown rules in the state of California, which says something about the extent of the fervor with which we are pursuing within one little fence COVID policy at the expense of everything else. Well, I want to warn you that you're going to study PPE, that there are drawbacks of being a PPE person, because the first response to every claim that you hear is to wonder to yourself, I wonder what is the strongest counter argument to that position. Everyone counter argues things they disagree with. PPE people tend to argue things that they actually agree with, which actually makes you have to stand alone at parties. So you believe, as a matter of morality, that the infant mortality rate should not be zero, that it should not be zero. I'm not saying it's too expensive. I'm saying that it is a moral mistake to try to say that the infant mortality rate should be zero. It's an evil goal. And the reason is that that would increase the total amount of suffering. Now, you can say that that's a utilitarian problem. Well, yes, accepting trade-offs and understanding that the entire group we have to be concerned with, not individuals who have particularly heart-rending stories, is the approach that PPE takes. The reason that we don't want the infant mortality rate to be zero is that the cost of a course of action is not money. It's the resources that are used instead of doing something else. We obsess, for example, if you're in the hospital, we want to know what your temperature is. Well, temperature is actually a pretty arbitrary thing. Heat is not, but temperature is a pretty arbitrary thing. We have 4 different measures of temperature. So the Fahrenheit scale, or the Rankine scale, which starts at absolute 0, Celsius, or the Kelvin scale, which starts at absolute 0. If I tell you your temperature is 5 degrees Fahrenheit above normal, that has real implications, even though it's a made-up measure. It's actually totally mythical. The amount that a degree represents doesn't actually mean anything. Well, that's basically the same argument that I often hear about money. How could you say that a human life is worth money? Money is not actually a real thing. That's right, that's true. But if you're a PPE person, you know that money is a metric for a very real concept that affects human health, and that's the opportunity cost of resources. If I tell you a policy costs $2 trillion, who cares? That's a bunch of paper. But it is measuring something real. It is measuring the value, satisfaction, and in many cases, lives lost as a result of a policy. So one of the things that being a PPE person means is that you're going to have to take into account considerations that other people would like to dismiss. Now, let me say a little more about PPE. I would say that we should study PPE because it is a palliative to a set of problems that face both academic research and undergraduate education. Undergraduate education tends to be stovepipe because academics find it useful to concentrate, and division of labor is a fine thing, but they tend to concentrate on tiny, narrow areas. Now, we want our students to be better than we are as faculty, and often that's not very difficult to accomplish. We want students to be able to go out and do things in the world. So the fact that academics is focused in narrow disciplines doesn't mean that education should be. The academic study of these areas, philosophy, politics, and economics, has become increasingly specialized, but the pedagogical requirements for creating an educated citizenry capable of dealing with the 21st century have become broader and more difficult to satisfy in the classroom. So I see the proliferation of PPE programs as a recognition that the stovepiping of academic disciplines is failing students. Whether it fails faculty, we shouldn't care. It's failing students, and that means we have an obligation to do better. Now, one of the things about academics is that we defend our borders. Economics, political science, philosophy scholars, they all become absorbed by similar questions, but they're prevented by heavily defended academic borders from taking advantage of progress in related disciplines. And so I sometimes now publish in philosophy journals, and economists will say, well, how can you talk to those people? I don't understand what they're talking about. Well, you should work a little harder to recognize that some of these are broad questions that can be answered in multiple ways. Which raises the question of fence rows. This comes from the preface of The Calculus of Consent, a famous book written by James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock. And they use the metaphor of the fence row. And for a long time, particularly before we had artificial chemical fertilizers, the most fertile parts of a field were those that were the fence rows, because none of the fence row had been planted. It hadn't been plowed. And there were a lot of nutrients in that soil that had never been used. So they finished, though, with a quote from Robert Frost: "Good fences make good neighbors, and neighborly relations stand in danger of being disturbed by furrowing too near the borderline." So the most fertile ground is on the fence rows, but if you get too near the fence row, then your neighbor will complain. Your neighbor in the philosophy department or the political science department will complain. Well, if you go and look at that Robert Frost poem, many people will quote that line from it: "Good fences make good neighbors." Is that true? What Robert Frost actually said in his poem Mending Wall, 1914, "I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each." So they put the boulders back up on the fence if they've fallen off. Oh, it's just another kind of outdoor game, one on a side. It comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pine, I tell him. He only says, "Good fences make good neighbors." Well, he's making fun of the idea that good fences make good neighbors. And then look at the part in red. "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down." What is it that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down? And the answer is PPE. PPE doesn't love walls. It wants them down. It wants us actually to deal with the people in different disciplines who are working on the same question, even though it's uncomfortable, because in a lot of cases, the truth tokens in that other discipline are different from our own. But there's something else that doesn't like a wall, that wants it down. And that's a COVID pandemic. A global COVID pandemic wants a wall down. So if all you're concerned about is what's on the left side of that scale, if all you're concerned about is COVID-19, you're dismissing the opportunity cost of those policies. And many of these are not just money. Many of these are not the arbitrary unit of dollars. Some of these are directly costly to human lives: higher suicide rate, domestic violence, a lost generation of young people in derailed education, shorter lifespans, and a decrease in public health services. There's been an explosion in the number of people who are supposed to go get chemotherapy for cancer that have not been going because they're so afraid of catching COVID. Well, if you die of cancer, it doesn't matter if you've avoided catching COVID. So let me stop that for a second. So that video is from atop the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and I was there with my wife, and she probably imagined that I would take her in my arms. It was sundown, sunset in romantic Paris, and she probably thought I would take her in my arms and kiss her and say, "Je t'aime, mon petit chou." But no, I was running around the top of the Arc de Triomphe taking videos. And the reason that this video is important, I said my theme has been something there is that does not like a wall. Let me ask, you've seen the video a little bit, let's go back and look at it again. What is it that you do not see in the road that goes around the Arc de Triomphe? Well, what is it? And by now you've formed it in your mind. It is lane markers. There are no lane markers in the circle that goes around the Arc de Triomphe. It turns out that lane markers were causing more accidents. So the Arc de Triomphe, that circle, is the only place in Europe that has the following liability rule. The liability rule is basically every person is responsible for the damages that they create. So if you have an accident, you take the sum of the value of the damages to the two cars, and then you divide it by two. And the link here is a description of the insurance policy. If I have an old beater of a car and you have a Mercedes, and there's $7,000 total damage, 100 to mine and 6,900 to yours, we each pay 3,500, which means we're both really careful to avoid damages. We're really careful to avoid accidents. So by removing the lane markers and creating a set of incentives for everyone to be responsible for themselves, there was a 30% increase in traffic. It's one of the most interesting examples I've ever seen of a change in institutions that left people to their own responsibility, and that then caused an unexpected increase in efficiency. Not only were there fewer accidents, although you can see why that would be true, 30% more traffic was able to go through the Place Étoile. So I want to try to use that as a metaphor for understanding what COVID policy might look like. That individual responsibility rather than a top-down attempt to impose lane markers. Now, one of the problems is there is a political logic of policy analysis. And the way that it works is X is a problem. We should do something. Y is something. Therefore, we should do Y. If Y does not solve X, it must mean we didn't do enough Y and we need to do more. If you oppose doing more Y, you must hate people who suffer from X. Now that's sort of abstract. Let's look at an actual example. Suppose it's 1824. Your daughter has a fever. She's very sick. You love your daughter. You call a doctor. Doctor says, she's got a really high fever. We must do something. Something in 1824 was bleeding, because the theory of medicine was that you were sanguine. There were 4 humors. If you had too much of one of the humors, then it needed to be removed. And so they would pull out blood. And there you see the physician who is removing blood from the arm of your daughter. Now, she doesn't get any better. So the doctor bleeds her again. She dies. The conclusion is we must not have done enough bleeding, because we have this theory that we're not going to abandon. Anything that looks like a contradiction, we just say, well, we didn't do it enough. If it doesn't work, we didn't do it enough. Now, if you disagree, it's not that there's some possibility that you're right, it's that you must hate children. Now, if you think I exaggerate, that's basically the argument that John Maynard Keynes made about government spending. And in fact, I have offered just now an almost verbatim summary of every article that Paul Krugman has ever written. If we're still in a recession, it can only be because we didn't spend enough. So it's the same thing. There's a problem. We should do something. If it doesn't work, we didn't do enough. And if you oppose it, you must hate poor people. The problem is that PPE is inherently comparative, not ideal theory. So many philosophers are interested in ideal theory and what an ideal society would look like. But we actually have a number of comparisons of the way that different societies work. And this is a very famous satellite picture taken of the Korean Peninsula. And you can see where South Korea is and where North Korea is. This is a country with an ancient culture. People have lived there for a very long time. And we had a natural experiment where we had 2 different cultures. South of the line, we have liberty, prosperity, and health. North of the line, we have repressive authoritarian regime and people dying of starvation. There's a big difference between systems. Does that mean that the South Korean system is ideal? It does not. we should be comparativists in PPE, not do ideal theory. Well, how does that apply to the COVID pandemic? I always feel like Treebeard, and the problem is that PPE turns you into Treebeard. You may remember Treebeard the Ent in Lord of the Rings said, "I am not altogether on anybody's side because nobody is altogether on my side." Because remember, in PPE, the first thing that you do is always say, what's the best counter argument to that position? So if I agree with someone, but then they say something else that I think, that's probably not quite right, the point is not whether I agree with their conclusion. The point is we need to try to use principles that are general. Now, you may remember that the principle we started out with in maybe March 1st of 2020 was to flatten the curve. So the number of cases without protective measures would be so high that we would overwhelm the hospitals. So the horizontal dotted line is the healthcare system capacity. But we can flatten the curve with protective measures. So the flatter blue curve means that, yes, people will still get sick, but it'll be spread out over time and we will not overwhelm the capacity of the healthcare system. So it's hard to believe now, but the first announcement, March 16th, 2020, was 15 days to slow the spread. We're going to close down the economy for 15 days. I actually made this as a meme on Facebook. It seems silly now, but March 20th, 2020, Liam Neeson, instead of calling his daughter, "Listen to me, they will take you." He says, "Listen to me, it will infect you. But if we can slow the spread, the medical system can handle it." Well, what happened? We slowed the spread, and notice that this is 6 months later. This is October. And in between October 1st and November 5th, there was a giant increase over much of Europe. Masks, no masks, shutdown, no shutdown. All we did by closing down the economy was defer the time when we get the enormous increase. So that was not actually a solution. First we damaged the economy, and then we didn't flatten the curve. We actually had the worst of both worlds. We systematically destroyed the economy of many nations in the world. And then by opening up in a way that didn't actually account for the fact that we hadn't accomplished anything by destroying the economy, many countries of the world overwhelmed their medical system. So if we look at government responses, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but the three countries here, the Nordic countries, there's Finland, Sweden, and Norway. Well, those countries, all the colors here, the light colors, mean that they had a much less restrictive response to COVID. Finland and Norway had a lot fewer excess deaths, and many people said it was because of Sweden's policies to try to achieve herd immunity. Sweden actually tried to do the thing about flattening the curve that I said at the outset, but they didn't close down their economy. Well, in June of 2020, Finland and Norway actually completely opened their economy. So if you look at the three countries, Finland, Norway, and Sweden, that in the developed world had some of the least restrictive government policies, yes, they had a fair number of cases, but they did not destroy their economies, and they proceeded using a different kind of approach. So if we look at two nations, South Korea and the United States, the date of the first COVID case was the same, January 18th. After 3 months, South Korea, which is a much smaller country, had administered more than 300,000 tests. The United States had less than 80,000. The date that testing was authorized in Korea was January 25th. In the US, it was February 21st, almost a full month later. South Korea deregulated testing, and South Korea, interestingly, licensed private labs to test. The US didn't do that until June. You couldn't get tests until June. Now, if you're going to do like the cars that are going around the Arc de Triomphe, and if you're going to manage your own life, you have to be able to get access to testing. The United States used the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC to prevent the availability of testing because they wanted to be able to keep control of it. So was this a disaster for South Korea? Well, it was not. They had 4.5 deaths per 100,000 population, and the US had almost 200 deaths per 100,000 population. So the availability of testing made a giant difference. Overall, South Korea had far fewer cases, 515 cases per 100,000 population. The US had 12,000 cases per 100,000 population. Now you can argue that there's a bunch of other differences. And I guess I've said, if you're a PPE person, your first thought should be, what's the best counter argument to this position? And you might say, well, South Korea locked down a lot more. That's not the entire difference. I accept that. But what South Korea did do was enlist the private sector from the beginning and allow people to take responsibility from their own health, rather than sitting home and watching Anthony Fauci tell them what they should do. There's another graph here that goes in the other direction. And I want to make an argument that I haven't heard often enough. So what we see here is two other nations, and then I say it's endogeneity. So this is Israel versus Sweden. So notice that over time, this is daily new cases per 1 million population. In October, November, December, both Sweden and Israel go pretty high, but Israel goes much higher. Sweden stayed fairly high and then started to decline by August. Israel went much higher. And you'll notice that Israel had much more restrictive mask mandates. And in fact, the mask mandate was reinstated June 24th just because a giant spike. Now, some people have looked at this and said, okay, that means that masks don't work. Well, wait, not so fast. The fact is that economists need to teach philosophers about the problem of endogeneity. So if you were to look at this, you might say, well, gosh, masks don't work. Look, that Israel used masks and they had an increase. Sweden did not use masks and they had no increase. The reason that Israel imposed a mask mandate was that they had a big increase in cases. So it was an endogenous response to a policy problem, which means that you actually have to know quite a bit of economics and quite a bit of philosophy to be able to do PPE successfully. So I have quite a few other things that I can talk about, but I had agreed to stop at about 4:30. And I know there's going to be questions. I may use some of this to answer additional questions. I have quite a few more graphs, and I'm happy to talk about focus protection and the Great Barrington Declaration. But for now, let's see if there's any questions so that we don't get too far behind on time.
Thanks, Mike. There will be some questions, I'm sure, popping up quickly. I'll just go ahead and ask one that I have had that I wanted to raise that connects some of these questions back to the threefold discipline distinction. I often find in PPE discussions that philosophical principles and economic analysis are combined without necessarily addressing the question of political, I don't know if you want to call it political systems or political dynamics. And so how do we, for example, in this context, how do we talk about how different, maybe perhaps different political systems utilize the philosophical principles and the economic analysis, or some of the political dynamics which either hinder or encourage, what you want to call good policy?
One of the difficulties is that I, being an economist, think that I am capable of deciding what good policy is. Philosophers, being trained philosophers and therefore dangerous, think they are capable of identifying what justice is. Political scientists basically throw up their hand and say, it's a democracy. You people can say whatever you want, but in fact, you have to persuade a majority of voters in order to accomplish anything. And so the difficulty that I find is economists often will criticize philosophers by saying, you're just worried about justice, things that you think are a moral imperative. Well, those are just trade-offs. And I'm an expert in trade-offs, and I can find the optimal trade-off. And we can identify the exact cost of a human life, and that will tell us how long the COVID shutdown should last. And I can do that to 2 decimal places. And the problem in a democracy is that we have to persuade voters, we have to provide information to them. And that I think is the advantage of the metaphor that I wanted to use about the cars that are going around the Arc de Triomphe, because there is no top-down direction there. We set up a system, people do the best that we can. Now, it's true that we need to come up with rules that promote that sort of good outcome. But the idea of the man of system directing each piece on the chessboard without taking account of the fact that each has its own principle of motion. And that principle of motion might seem perverse to me because we disagree politically. So the philosophy and economics part leaves out the essential role of persuasion. And political scientists often recognize the important role of persuasion, but they still think of it as being top-down. I think that if we could create system, and that was the thing that was about focus protection, where we think of each individual and try to put them in a setting where they can succeed. That should be the job of the authorities, not to order people to do what the authorities think are the best thing.
Thank you for a very good response to my question. Roy Miller has asked a couple questions, but I'll get the first one. At what point should there be mandates, or where should they be? Is that something you can answer, or how do we set about answering that kind of question?
Well, it depends what kind of mandates you mean, and there are a lot of mandates that could happen. They could range from social distancing and masks, which are not very onerous, to a mandate that you have to take the vaccine or you will be killed. I mean, in principle, we could make lack of vaccination a capital crime. I think that's as far as you. So there's a big range there about what mandates could be. The argument is that someone who's not wearing a mask and isn't vaccinated creates 2 externalities, what economists call externalities. And an externality is a cost that I impose on someone else without their permission. It's a kind of violence. An externality, in a way, is a kind of violence. Now, normally we allow something like the tort system to handle that because I can sue you, we can let manners solve the problem. But the 2 kinds of externalities is I can infect you with the disease, or I can become infected myself and I can take up a bed in an ICU that is needed for someone who has a heart attack or needs cancer surgery. And I've only done it because I'm an idiot and I got infected through my own lack of following the right procedures. Now, that's the argument. That might or might not be true. Maybe it isn't. Maybe we shouldn't worry about these things at all. The question is, to what extent and at what point should mandates then be imposed against the will of the people who are suffering the mandate? How much can we punish them for doing something that they believe to be wrong? And I think that's a very difficult question. So with the vaccines in particular, providing incentives of the sort, if you get the vaccine, you can travel. Now, I just flew to the Czech Republic and back. I was teaching for 2 weeks. This is humble bragging, I realize. I was teaching for 2 weeks in Prague in the Severo PPE master's program, and it was just fantastic. And I was vaccinated. Everything in Prague is open. You wouldn't even know that they have 15 cases per 100,000. It was great. And 60% of the population is vaccinated. So there really are a bunch of positive things that happen if you don't have many cases and if there are, if many people are vaccinated. So it's a usual kind of collective action problem. I am just skeptical about mandates, full stop.
Yeah. And can I just piggyback on that question that's from the same person, but it's relevant. Should we prevent private organizations from having mandates, or should we allow firms or schools, especially private schools, from creating their own mandates?
This is something that has given me great delight because for a long time I was a defender of my conservative friends when they said, you know, a baker in Indiana should not have to make a cake for a same-sex marriage couple, because the business that you own, you have rights and you can decide how you run your own business. And if you don't want to employ someone, you don't have to. And I said, yes, that's true. There is freedom of contract. But now many of my conservative friends say, oh no, you cannot, as a private business, require a vaccine in order to work there, even though many vaccines for a variety of other diseases have already been required by businesses without there being any problem. You can have drug testing be required, where I actually get some of your urine and test whether it's true. So I actually think that, and so I'm skeptical of mandates full stop by the government, I should have said. I actually think that private businesses have very substantial rights to negotiate contracts privately with individuals. However, I think that only if my friends on the left will agree that it's also true that the baker doesn't have to make that cake if he or she doesn't want to. It's a package. Economic rights are a package. Freedom of contract is a package. And both the left and the right seems to want to pick and choose.
Nicely said. Thank you. We have a question, international question from Vishnu Raghavan. Why is it that countries such as Vietnam, which locked down, end up seeing very few cases?
Each country has, South Korea locked down and also had very few cases. It is possible to lock down and have very few cases. The question is, how do you get out of it? And so we could certainly reduce the number of COVID cases by not just locking down, but executing the entire population. There would be far fewer COVID infections. So if your sole goal, this was the balance that I talked about, Vietnam devastated much of its economy. And in fact, it has been estimated that 160 million people worldwide are going to go back into extreme poverty because of COVID lockdowns. Nearly 3 million of those are in Vietnam. So now remember, extreme poverty is $2 per day. That's $2 per day. That if you're below $2 a day, you're really very poor. Not that many people in Vietnam were in extreme poverty. As a result of the lockdown, a fair number are now back in poverty. So I don't think the goal should be to minimize the number of COVID cases. I think the goal should be to minimize human suffering. And that takes some balance of letting people be educated, letting people work, and giving them a chance to be in cars that go around the Arc de Triomphe and wear masks and socially distance and do the things that they choose to do as individuals. Let me say, if you have not read the Great Barrington Declaration, the focused protection idea is that the United States and most countries should have done much more to restrict nursing homes and older people. We did not do enough for them, and then we did too much to almost all of the rest of the economy. So focused protection would say that we need to think of individuals rather than an overall average policy that applies to everyone. The problem with state action is that the rule of law means that it's a very blunt instrument, applies to everyone. So your question about Vietnam, the lockdown affected everyone. If instead they had mostly focused on helping old people and let most of the others go on about their business and have a mask mandate, that would have been a still better policy. But it is true that many countries were relatively successful with lockdowns if your objective is just to eliminate COVID.
Thank you. I'll just give a shout out to your friend and mine, Matt Buffton from the Institute for Liberal Studies in Canada, for asking about my thoughts on the Great Barrington Declaration, which you have already answered, so we don't have to let him have you give another response. But James Strickland, a political scientist here at Arizona State, asks, Hi, Mike. I'm curious about your thoughts regarding federalism in the US and the coronavirus. Some people have argued that the states competing for business might lead to a race for public spending. Similarly, some popular press accounts suggest that federalism harmed the COVID since people were able to travel to short lockdown states for business or vacation. Is open borders across with state level health policy making a bad, or is it both good and bad?
One of the interesting aspects of PPE is its focus on something called rule utilitarianism. So rule utilitarianism is the idea that there's a relatively small number of general rules of organizations that we can use to have a system of government, which means that a problem like federalism has just the problems that you mentioned, James. And nice to see you, by the way. Well, nice to hear from you. I didn't get to see you. The alternative to federalism would be not federalism, where you have a single top-down kind of system. And the result would be we wouldn't have had the different states trying out legalizing drugs. We wouldn't have seen different states legalizing same-sex marriage. There's a variety of things that federalism allows the states to experiment with, which still might also cause just the problems that you say. But you can't pick and choose the aspects of federalism. Okay, we're going to suspend it for this one thing. People will not be able to travel across state borders. No, you can't do that. You don't get to do that. So federalism comes with all of its warts. Overall, it is a far better system for a diverse country like the United States, where having responsive local government is better. But there is always the problem of something like a race to the bottom. Although I do think in this case that was exaggerated. Arizona was really quite open for a long time. And you look at the cases now, it's quite a bit better off than North Carolina. There's a bunch of state-specific things that dominate the policies, which mean I think that the race to the bottom idea, in this instance at least, has been exaggerated.
Thank you. Do you think that there's been a trust issue regarding government messaging, especially about public health? And can we do anything about that?
There has been a terrible trust issue. I will send you and ask you to put Professor Emmett some two links to an NPR program called Planet Money. Mm-hmm. And they actually looked at the process by which the CDC developed testing. Germany had a perfectly good test by the end of January. The United States took until the middle of March to be able to develop it. And even then, the rollout didn't really work. We were told that masks didn't work. In fact, maybe they make things worse. The reason we were told that, it later turned out, was that people were worried that there would be enough masks for hospital personnel. Now, that's a legitimate concern. We want to reserve masks for hospital personnel. But that's a terrible reason to tell people, no, forget masks. They're no good anyway. And then a month later saying, no, we actually need masks. So you may have seen those little videos about Anthony Fauci saying something and then contradicting himself. He has reasons for doing all of that. I think this did not cause the problems with trust, but the government's response to COVID across the partisan aisle made the pre-existing problems we had with trust much worse.
Thanks. Another question from Roy Miller. What can we learn from Australia?
There are some things that we do actually know, and that is that the way to achieve something like herd immunity is a combination of the number of people who have antibodies through surviving infection plus those who have been vaccinated. Australia decided on a strategy of pure suppression, not mitigation, pure suppression. They're an island, but they're a big island. If you've ever seen Australia superimposed on the US, it's about the same size. Australia is a really, really big island. And so the idea that they were going to be able to eliminate all the cases and then prevent anyone from coming into Australia and manage the cases in that way was really expensive. And so on one of the later slides I had that I didn't get to, but it's a picture you may have seen. There's a young man on his knees, handcuffs behind his hands, cuffed behind his back. 3 police standing around him with flashlights. And he had gone for a walk. It was a hot night. Forgive me, it was a cool night because it's winter. He had gone for a walk and he was arrested outside by himself wearing a mask. So I think Australia has handled this really well if you think that Australia is still a prison colony. Because remember that Australia was established as a prison colony. They have reestablished this idea that there should be total control of its population. Sydney is one of the largest cities in that part of the world. And it has turned into a prison compound. So I'm pretty militant about Australia. I've spent a lot of time there, and a lot of Australians are pretty laid back about a lot of things. But this fascistic impulse that the state is now acting on is terrifying, terrifying. And I don't care that they don't have many COVID cases. There's a lot of things worse than COVID cases.
And the cases are going up. We have another question about mandates. Do they become more effective or at least palatable if we push the authority to impose them to the most, down the chain to the most local branch of government in terms of thinking about providing for the common good?
Mask and social distancing mandates are not necessary in areas that do not have many cases. One of the mistakes that we've made is that a lot of these mandates were imposed at the state level. So James Strickland had asked me if federalism is a problem. I actually think we should be doing this at the level of neighborhood or city. So if a city is having a lot of cases, then they should have masks and mandates, maybe close down the businesses. But if you don't have many cases, like I said, I was just in the Czech Republic, the city of Prague, there's no cases, everything's great. Now it may come back and they'll have to mask up again. But this is a long-term process. There is no reason. Remember that it was 15 days to flatten the curve. It's been more than 15 months. And in many cases, we're still arresting people who go for a walk. So I think the localism and local discretion about mandates is the key to letting us live through this until the point when we get something like herd immunity. Now, you can argue that people don't know enough to be able to make their own choices. And if you believe that, then you should wonder about a whole bunch of other problems about democracy.
Speaking about the democracy writ large, what about the advice that we should be giving to POTUS on dealing with the pandemic? Let's go to the other end of the spectrum.
I don't know what the president should do. The president is in an awfully difficult spot. Most of these are police power questions or medical questions, which are mostly up to the states. And the CDC has performed incredibly badly over and over again. The CDC has gotten this wrong or been late or prevented access. So right now, for example, most European countries, if you want to get a test, you can pay €2, so what, $3.20, and be able to get a test that has about 90% accuracy. Those are illegal in the United States. And the reason is that the Food and Drug Administration is saying that these tests are not as accurate as the molecular tests that take 2 days to get back. Well, no, they're not. They don't cost $150 and they don't take 2 days to get back. I think I was exposed. I can take a $3 test to see with 90% accuracy, do I have this or not? So my advice to the president is something that I've actually been saying for a long time. So let me just try it out there. In a pandemic, everybody is a libertarian, Mr. President. In a pandemic, everybody is a libertarian. All of the stupid ideas about regulations that have piled up over time, like guano on an island, need to be shoveled off. We need to clean all of that up. All of those restrictions that never had any rational basis are preventing us from responding nimbly at a time when fast and decisive action could be saving thousands of lives by letting people make their own choices. But they have to be informed choices. If I know that I have COVID, I'm unlikely to go to that party, but I can't find out if I have COVID unless I spend $150 and wait 2 days. So we need to legalize the test that the rest of the developed world just now has available. We need to stop the Food and Drug Administration from being an obstructionist agency. And Mr. President, you have the power to do that. That's what I would tell POTUS. Damn it.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think we'll close with one final question, which I'll be interested to hear your response. What do you think is the general reluctance of people to not to listen to the experts?
It's really very disappointing, because having now whined about expertise and politicians, I'm completely on board with mask, vaccine, social distancing. We should do all of those things. And since it's a fair question, because I'm the one that's saying we shouldn't have mandates, we should use persuasion. Yes, but what if people are just so immersed in pig-headed ignorance that they actually will not even consider evidence against their own view? So I got vaccinated for the second time, March 23rd of 2020. I was teaching in person. Duke had an operation where I was able to get it pretty fast. March 23rd, 2021, forgive me, not 2020, that would have been very fast indeed. So March 23rd, 2021, this year, I was able to get vaccinated, and I did it as soon as I could. I still wear a mask. I actually think that the two considerations that I talked about, I don't want to give this to other people, and I don't want to get so sick that I take up an ICU bed that a cancer patient needs. Those are things that a considerate person should do. There's a lot of people who don't agree, and so what are we supposed to do about it? We have two bad choices. One is do nothing and continue to have restaurants that can't open because unvaccinated people are getting sick at such a high rate, which means that we're still destroying our economy, or force them at gunpoint in many cases, or at the threat of starvation, to get a piece of metal injected into their arm and a fluid injected into their bloodstream that they do not want. Those are both very unpalatable choices. So the fact that we are in the position of not being able to persuade people, that the science is actually pretty clear that the risk of being unvaccinated are higher than the risk of being vaccinated. There are risks to being vaccinated. That's fine. That's true. There's risk to driving a car, and yet I still do it. The risk of being vaccinated is about the same as the risk of driving a car to the office. It's not very high. The risk of getting COVID is very bad. That's really bad. And you're imposing it on others. And the argument that I just made is completely unpersuasive to literally millions of Americans, and I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah. Do the various mandates and reactions to them make the case clearly against authoritarian government dictates? So we're sort of on the same themes.
I don't think you can say it makes the case clearly, because there are some circumstances where I think coercion can be justified. Coercion can be justified in instances where we have consented in advance to rules where the government can come up with mandates according to a particular process. The reason that I have some sympathy with that question, though, is that the government didn't follow the process in this case. The scientific process wasn't followed, the political process wasn't followed. And so the mandates are coming out of a process that people, I think, rightly see as being not entirely legitimate. So there is a case here against authoritarian government. It's not only you have to do the right thing, the government has to do it the right way. It has to be transparent and it has to consult with people, actually get their consent. So it's not the mandates, it's the authoritarian process by which the mandates were arrived at that I object to. But with that caveat, yes, it is an argument against authoritarianism because a lot of the British call this bloody minded. If you're bloody minded, then you resist something just because you were told to do it.
I'm not sure I'm going to ask the question that just came up. I'm going to try to interpret exactly what it was meant. Yeah, so, where do we begin to quantify the foregone wellness care that might have happened?
We know the rate at which people were going for cancer treatments. We know the rate at which people were going to get mammographies. There's going to be women with stage 4 cancer that's not going to be diagnosed, that could have been diagnosed at stage 2 because of the difficulties that we're having. Now, the question is, which way do we interpret that? Is it because the ICUs were full because we didn't have a vaccine mandate? Or was it because we had shut the economy down and overemphasized the costs of COVID to the expense of everything else? So the difficulty is, I think we can quantify the costs of healthcare foregone. We can quantify the increase in suicides. We can look at the number of small businesses that have closed as a result. The difficulty is attributing those to which particular phenomenon causally. So that's the reason that I think PPE, since we're closing, is important, is you need to have someone who can talk about different ethical criteria, but also can understand the problems of using statistical methods to infer causation. That's what PPE aspires to do. The one person or one group of people can actually do all of those things at once. So I realize that our time is up. It has been really great to talk to you guys, and I appreciate this opportunity.
And I was going to say we were wrapping up too. And so thank you, Mike, for doing this and for participating in this, and look forward to future conversations with you as our PPE program develops and as students wish to engage you with other questions. So thank you very much.